all set, right? Let's take a look at the first mistake, which is not floating enough against small c-bets. So the thing about small bets is that they tend to be very depolarized. Most of the time when in position goes for a 33% c-bet, the intention is to be able to bet a bunch of marginal hands, for example, middle pair, pocket pair type hands. And if you think about what all of those hands are going to do after recall, almost all of them are just going to check behind on the turn. And what this means is that not only are we getting a pretty good price to call, we're also paying to see two cards very often instead of just one card, because when we call, turn is going to go check really often, and we're also going to get to see a free river. And especially versus wide ranges like button versus big blind, our ace highs and king highs tend to have pretty decent equity in the first place. So if you pair that together with the fact that we're getting decent pot odds, right, the result tends to be a really wide calling range. So even on ace high boards, for example, so let's take a look at the first example, which is an a7 deuce rainbow board. So how many of you guys would float a hand like king queen in this case versus a 33% c-bet? Okay, Caesar says every time. So seems like most of you guys are floating hands like king queen, right? But what about king jack or king 10 without the backdoor? Okay, it seems like most of you guys are playing quite accurately then, right? So I mean combos without the backdoor, right? Of course, with the backdoor, it's slightly more reasonable call. But if you actually take a look at what the solver is doing versus the small bet, yeah, I can see in the chat like some of you guys are folding with the backdoor as well, right? And of course, if you're folding with the backdoor, you're probably folding without the backdoor, and that would actually be a mistake, because if you look at what the solver is doing with king high specifically, right, even the combos that don't have backdoor flush draw, so king high plus no draw, right, the king 10 and above is actually just calling all the time. So again, it might look a little bit loose to begin with, but given all these factors that we've mentioned so far, right, first of all, getting really good direct pot odds, and then secondly, also looking at the way that button is likely to play the turn. Let's say if you call the flop and you look at button strategy across all of these possible turns, you'll see that button on average is only barreling about a third of the time. So 2/3 of the time, you're actually going to get to see a free river on top of a free turn. And this is, of course, part of the reason why we're allowed to float this wide. Looking at what happens on the 6 of spades, for instance, right? All of these marginal hands like under pair, second pair, third pair, they're all just going to be checking behind. And of course, even a hand like king 10 is going to have pretty decent equity against every one of these combos. So that is, in a nutshell, why we tend to float a little bit wider than what you might expect. And yet another reason for this is that if you look at button's range on this board, so button's range as a whole is going to have a ton of offsuit Broadway combos. So stuff like queen jack offsuit, queen 10 offsuit, or just hands like jack 9 offsuit, basically this region of 9x offsuit plus. And the thing about boards that have side cards that are quite low, so a7 deuce, a6 4, king 4 3, and so on, is that the board doesn't actually interfere with any of button's potential bluffs. So button actually has quite a bit of trash, and the more trash he has, the better it is for our king highs, of course, because we are beating way more of our opponent's potential bluffs. And later on, we can also take a look at some boards like ace 9 deuce, and then you'll see that because the 9 actually blocks a lot of button's potential bluffs, so we end up floating a slightly tighter range, right? But the basic idea is that on boards like a7 deuce, right, the board actually allows button to have all of these high card combos. So this further increases the equity of hands like king queen, king jack, and even hands like king 10 with no backdoor are calling at some frequency. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so when it comes to exactly how wide we get to float, because obviously there's a certain limit in terms of floating, right? We do get to call like king 10, but king 9 is just a fold, of course, right? But in order to determine where exactly this calling threshold is, there's actually a simple trick that you can use, and that's just to think in terms of the equity of our hand. So there's no need to complicate things by considering the rest of your range, right, and trying to defend at a certain frequency, because the fact is this is not a spot where we would want to defend MDF, where we're not trying to hit a certain target calling frequency, because our range is way too wide to be able to do that. So for the most part, we're just going to fold all of our trash hands. And when you look at specific hands in our range, like King Jack or King 10, the main consideration is simply how much equity they have. And this equity is affected by two main factors, right? First of all, the wider valence ranges, the more equity we're going to have, of course, right? So that's why we tend to, we're allowed to float much wider versus button compared to versus early position, let's say. And the second factor would be the connectivity of the board, right? Meaning the more disconnected the board is, the more equity our king highs actually have. So let's continue looking at a bunch of ace high boards. So previously we looked at ace 7 deuce, and then we saw that for the most part, if you have king high with no backdoor, you can actually float pretty wide, right? King 10, king jack, king queen, they're all pure calls. So let me now change the deuce to a 6. So slightly more coordinated board, right? And because of that, right, the equity of our king highs actually decreases somewhat. Right? We're still ahead of plenty of hands, and for the most part, we're still ahead of the same hands. But the problem is that a lot of these hands, like 10-9 and 9-8, right, they've all picked up equity against us. So this tends to hurt the equity of our king high floats, and as a result, we tend to call a little bit tighter. So again, if I go back to a7 deuce, if you look at the equity of a hand like king queen offsuit, right, we have 44%, right? And then with king jack, we have 42. If you change this to a 6, of course, it's going to go down a little bit. Right now, even king queen only has 41%. And of course, that explains why we're not allowed to be floating quite as wide. Okay? And we can also change the 6 to the 6 of hearts. And now this is going to worsen the situation, of course, right? So we're still ahead of the same hands for the most part, but there's going to be way more straight draws and flush draws in our opponent's range. And we're pretty much flipping against all of these hands at this point. So if you have king high with no backdoor, it actually just becomes a pure fold. Of course, if we have king queen with a heart, we will probably get to float these hands. But the thing is, we have some extra equity because of our backdoor flush draw. So to actually make it a fair comparison, we should really be comparing the combos that don't have any kind of backdoor draw, and clearly they're just folding all the time because of the extra connectivity and because of the fact that even the hands that we are beating, a lot of them are going to have significant equity against us. So given the same pot odds, we just end up playing a little bit tighter. Okay, so coming back to a7 deuce, right, I want to do one more comparison, right, which is to change the 7 to a 9. And even though the board is still pretty disconnected, you can see that the overall effect is that we call much tighter on ace-9 deuce, right? So previously we were calling king 10, king jack, and king queen all the time. Right now, king 10 is a pure fold, and king jack is even starting to mix. We're even folding some of the king highs with the backdoor flush draw, which we were actually rarely doing on ace-7 deuce. Right? I believe most of the king highs with backdoor are just pure calls, and we even call a bunch of hands like queen high with the backdoor. Right? And again, you know, these two bars, they look kind of similar, but the thing about the 9 is that it interferes with a lot of buttons high card hands, because again, when you look at this offsuit region, right, there's a ton of hands like 9x offsuit and really not that much 7x offsuit. So it actually makes a pretty big difference when you go from a7 deuce to ace-9 deuce. You remove a lot of the potential bluffs that you were previously beating, right? And on top of that, of course, these hands, they now a lot of them actually hit one pair. So it's really going to hurt the equity of your king high hands. Right? Looking at a hand like king queen or king jack, you actually barely have 40% equity. And then once again, this is the main reason why we start calling much tighter, right? Because we are basically just behind the bigger part of our opponent's range, right? Given that the board is blocking a lot of his offsuit bluffs. Okay, so this brings us to the first quiz question, which is that on the board of queen 3 deuce, so this one is also for button versus big blind. Let's say if we have a hand like jack 10 offsuit, right? So facing a 1/3 pot size bet, do you guys think this hand is pure call, pure fold, or indifferent? So let me pull up the poll. And it seems like we have pretty close, seems pretty split between pure call and indifferent. Right? And the correct answer is, in fact, that jack 10 is indifferent. Right? So what's the point of this question? Right? It's really to show that even though you might understand conceptually what determines your calling threshold, right? The concept alone is not enough to play good poker. Right? You might know that on queen 3 deuce, it's a rainbow board. It's really disconnected. The 3 and the deuce don't interfere with any of button's offsuit bluffs, but that alone doesn't actually tell you where exactly the threshold is, and you're still going to make occasional mistakes, right? Like maybe folding a hand like jack 10, because yes, you're supposed to float pretty wide, but who is to say that you float as wide as jack 10, right? That's not really 100% clear. So there's fortunately there's a good solution to this problem, and that's just to do a little bit of practice with the GTO trainer. So let me show you guys how you can use GTO Wizards trainer, right? Just to refine your intuition in terms of where exactly this calling threshold is. Right? So in terms of how to set up the trainer, of course, you want to be using the solution that you think is the most representative of what you encounter in practice. Right? So you pick the appropriate rake structure, stack size, and then you can set up a custom drill for, let's say, button open versus big blind call. Right? And you choose the type of board that you want to practice. So let's say we want to practice the entire subset of disconnected boards. Right? Now you can go to big blind check. And then what I like to do is practice versus a bunch of different c-bet sizes. So you can start off with versus 1/3, right? And then once you get comfortable with that, you can move on to a bigger bet size, right? So I would typically suggest practicing the two extremes. So if you go like 33 and then you go like 75 or 125, and whatever is in between, you can kind of just extrapolate from there, right? So let's start off with 33, and you can also go to settings, right? And you can go to hands and select close decision. So this is a really useful tool when you're trying to build a better intuition for where the threshold is, because you don't want to waste time. If you go for like all possible hands, the solver is gonna give you hands like top pair that is obviously a call, or it's gonna give you some kind of complete trash once in a while that it's a fold. So instead, if you select close decisions, right, every single hand that you get will be not that far off from being indifferent. So this really speeds up the whole process, right, of building a better feel for where exactly this threshold is. And something else that you can do is also to, instead of drilling the full hand, you just want to start off by practicing a single spot, because to drill turns and rivers as well, it's kind of distracting. Right now, we just have one goal, which is to build a better intuition for how wide we're supposed to float the flop, and it's not really necessary to drill the rest of the hand to do that. Right, it kind of defeats the whole purpose of working with the trainer in the first place. So this is how I would set up the drill. Right? So it's going to give you a random hand on a random board, and it's going to ask you with 9-7 versus a small bet. Right? Are we supposed to call this hand? Right? So you can make a guess. Right? Let's say if so 9-7 is we have the lower end of a gutter. So let's say if I think that this hand is too weak to call because it's not like drawing to the nuts, and there's also like a bunch of flush draws that you're dominated by. So if I fold this hand, yeah, so this gives me some kind of positive feedback that this hand is in fact supposed to be folding, right? Or if I had called this hand instead, the trainer is going to tell me that I've made a mistake, so that the next time around, if I get a similar situation, I'm going to have a better feel for where the threshold is. So it doesn't actually take that long, right? Especially with this close decisions tool, right? Whereby you just have to spend maybe like 20 minutes or so, right? 10, 20 minutes, and you should already have a pretty good feel for where this defending threshold is, right? So again, if you decide to float this hand, right, chances are it's going to tell you that it's a mistake, right? So the next time around, you'll know that, yes, while we should be floating pretty wide on this kind of texture, right, Jack 9 is just a little bit too wide, because the fact is understanding how a spot works conceptually, or understanding conceptually what affects the calling threshold, is completely different from knowing where exactly the threshold is. So Caesar is asking if we only, will the decisions only be between calling and folding? Well, for this specific spot, when we face a c-bet, of course, we have the option to raise as well. But for the time being, as in for just for the purpose of building a good intuition for where the threshold is, right, we can kind of just ignore the raising option for now. So what we focus on is whether a hand gets to continue or whether it doesn't get to continue, right? And then that also kind of builds a good foundation for the kinds of hands that you should be check raising, right? Although that's probably a topic for a different video. Okay, so that's how you can continue to work on the spot on your own, right? Build a better intuition for the kinds of hands that you're supposed to be calling. Okay, so just some food for thought, right? How do we exploit someone who is not floating enough? Because I imagine it is pretty unlikely that most of your opponents are going to be calling, hands like King 10 on, A7 deuce, or floating hands like Jack 10 offsuit on Queen 3 deuce. So if they are missing these calls, then they're going to be making a mistake, and there should be some kind of way to exploit this mistake. So I can see some comments in the chat, right, saying that we should c-bet our entire range, which is of course correct. Right? Our bluffs in particular are going to generate a lot more EV, given the fact that our opponent is not defending enough. There is also one more adjustment that we can make on the turn, and yeah, Marcio has hit the nail on the head. Bluff a lower frequency on the turn, because a lot of our flop bluffs, right, well, they enjoy higher EV on the flop, right, but the fact is your opponent is calling too tight of a range. He's folding too much of his air. So when you get to the turn, and when you think about the EV of double barreling all of your air, a lot of this EV is going to come from folding out hands like King 10 on A7 deuce. And if those hands are not present in your opponent's range, then it really makes it much less attractive to be barreling the turn. So Naveen also makes a really good point, right? On top of, okay, I wouldn't say we want to bet a lot of trash. I guess you're referring to the flop, right? So yes, we bluff more on the flop, right? But on the turn, we actually want to give up most of our air. And with our good hands specifically, I think there is a good argument for betting a little bit thinner on the turn. So let's take a look at let's go back to the previous example. Yeah, I guess first of all we should look at this Queen 3 deuce board as well. So just to show you guys, I have like Jack 10 is actually mixing between call and fold, right? But overall, you can see that the defending range is extremely wide, right? Simply because the 3 and the deuce are really disconnected, right? The board being rainbow and the 3 and deuce not interfering with any of Button's offsuit bluffs, right? This makes it really nice to be floating, pretty much any ace high, right? And then most of the king highs are going to be floating as well, right? And then if you have like Jack 10 offsuit, just with the backdoor straight draw alone, we definitely get to call at some frequency as well. Okay, so coming back to the previous point about, let's say if we get a blank turn, right? If your specific opponent is not able to find all of these floats like king 9, jack 10, king 10, right, then his range is going to be much tighter the times that he calls. Right? So on the turn, first of all, you want to barrel less of your air. You want to lean towards giving up more of your bluffs. And on top of that, a lot of these strong hands like Queen X, they actually have a little bit less reason to be checking behind, because exploitatively speaking, one reason why you check back hands like Queen Jack and Queen 10 and Queen 9 is to induce a river bluff, right, from all of these hands that were previously floating on the flop. But if your opponent does not have these hands in this range, then it's going to lower the EV of checking. So all else equal, betting actually becomes a slightly better option. Right? So let's say if you think the only mistake your opponent is making is overfolding the flop, right? Then the main adjustments we want to be making would, number one, to c-bet wider on the flop, or c-bet more bluffs specifically. Number two, give up most of our bluffs on the turn. And number three, potentially barrel a little bit thinner on the turn with hands like top pair, since there is now one less reason to be checking behind and inducing a bluff on the river. And what this actually tells us is that in practice, it kind of makes it even more important to be finding all of these floats, because a lot of players and the population as a whole, right, they tend to very naturally bet too much top pair. So of course they might be doing this for the wrong reasons, but maybe they're just betting hands like, you know, Queen 9 and Queen 8 because they don't want to give your flush draws the chance to see a free river, right? But the fact is that they are betting a little bit too thin. And of course, there are also plenty of players who are unable to find enough bluffs, right? And I'm not referring to hands like flush draws and straight draws. I'm referring to the stuff that doesn't have any direct kind of equity. So hands like jack 9 with a spade, pretty high frequency bets, right? So with this hand doesn't even have a single overcard, but it's still betting quite often. And if your opponent isn't aware that he is supposed to be betting these hands quite often, then he would actually unknowingly be finding the right exploit against a player who is not floating enough on the flop. Because if you recall, the two of the main exploits, right, were to give up more air on the turn and also barrel more hands like top pair. So if someone is doing both of these things and you're also not finding enough of these calls, then you're actually unknowingly or by chance just getting exploited by most of the population. Right? So even more important to do a bunch of practice and to actually develop a better intuition for where exactly this threshold is. And then from there, maybe you can even float a little bit wider than what the solver suggests. Mistake number 2, calling too wide versus early position. So as we talked about earlier, against with any float in general, right, our decision rests mainly on how much equity our hand has. And of course, against a strong early position range, every hand is going to go down in equity. And especially when the board has multiple high cards, or especially when we're facing larger c-bet sizes, right, we need to call it even tighter. And, you know, it's one thing to say that we need to call tighter against early position. I think that's kind of obvious, right? But I think what most players tend to underestimate is the extent to which we start folding a lot of the hands that we previously would have called. So this is button versus big blind, and as you can see, right, versus a small bet, we tend to float pretty wide. So not quite as wide as before, because again, the 10 blocks a lot of it blocks a lot of buttons like offsuit, potential offsuit bluffs. So we definitely don't get to float quite as wide as support like A7-3. But still, you know, we're calling every single pocket pair. We're calling the occasional king high with backdoor flush draw, right? Not calling as much as before, but still, you know, king 9, queen 9, they're mostly indifferent, right? So this is very typical for button versus big blind. But the moment we go to early position versus big blind. Versus the same 1/3 c-bet size, what you see is a completely different strategy. Now we end up folding every single pocket pair below the 10. We even fold hands like 3x without the backdoor. And yeah, technically 3x is a slightly better defender than your pocket pair. Right? I know it might not seem that way because like 4s and 5s, they're technically stronger. But if you think about the number of outs that you have the times that you're behind, if you think about your hand's blocker properties, right, it's always better to have a pair to the board because you block less bluffs, and you also have more outs the times that you're behind. So to be folding a hand like Jack 3, Queen 3, it's really very unusual versus a small bet. And in fact, if you have a hand like middle pair, you can see certain combos of 10x, right? They're now just starting to be indifferent. And again, this is also very unusual for middle pair, a hand like middle pair to not have any inherent EV versus such a small bet. And this is really the result of UTG's range being extremely tight. You can see it's really concentrated towards these Broadway cards. So he's going to hit a bunch of ace-x, a bunch of 10x, even the hands that don't directly hit a pair. Many of them are going to have some kind of extra equity. So hands like king, queen, king, jack, they're all going to have a gut shot, and this really hurts the equity of every single one of big blind's floats, right? Even a hand like pocket nines is supposed to be pure folding. And part of the reason why this happens as well is that if you compare this with a button versus big blind situation, so on the board like ace 10 3, of course, if big blind has any kind of pocket pair, like 7s or 8s, he's never going to be folding, right? Because we are in a way beating a big part of our opponent's value range, meaning button will actually c-bet hands like 3x. He's going to c-bet hands like 4s and 5s, and almost all of those hands are going to just check behind on the turn and try and get to showdown. So that's where a huge chunk of your EV actually comes from. But for UTG versus big blind, that's almost never going to happen, because even if you float the flop of a hand like knights, let's say the turn is a blank, right? What you'll see UTG do is that he's actually turning a lot of these like 8s and 7s and 5s. He's just straight up turning these hands into a bluff. So that actually takes away a big source of your EV when you check out the flop, because you're almost never going to check it down and win against a worse hand. Right? You are going to check it down sometimes, but the times that you check it down, you're always going to run into hands like kings and queens and jacks, right? Stuff like weak ace-x. So in a way, you can say, what's the point of floating the flop, right? It's really not that attractive of an option, all things considered. Okay, so quiz question number 2. For UTG Open versus big blind call on a board of ace, king, 5, which of the following hands is a pure call facing a 2/3 pot size c-bet? So I'm going to pull up the second poll. So seems like most of you guys think that the answer is king 10, right? Yeah, I'm actually a little bit surprised by this. I kind of included king 9 as a red herring, actually, right? Just because I was pretty sure some people might think that the 9, that does a better job of unblocking most of UTG's bluffs, right? But it seems like most of you guys chose king 10 anyway. Right? But the correct answer is actually 4, 3 of clubs, right? So it's kind of counterintuitive, right? But let's take a look at why that's the case. Right? The problem is that UTG here is using a bunch of different sizes, so it might not be representative of what's actually happening in reality, because in reality, if your opponent is betting half pot, chances are that's the only size that he's using. So what we can do is actually use the AI, right, to just boil everything down into one single size. So you can go to custom solutions, create a new solution, and choose the ranges that you want. So UTG versus big blind, single raise pot. Okay. And so if you look at all of these sizes here, right, so this portion at the bottom is basically the sizes that you're allowing the AI to choose from, right? So out of all of these sizes, it's going to choose the single size that it thinks it's the best, right? But let's say if you want to, so for a board like ace, king, 5, let's say you want to force it to use a single size of your preference, right? You can click here and then you go like 33. Okay? And then that forces the AI to only bet a third of the pot, right? And then from there you have like a more, I guess, more accurate and more realistic big blind response that will probably be a little bit better compared to what you see in the standard solution library. Okay, so anyway, let's see versus a 2/3 pot size bet, like in the quiz question, or what hands are pure calls and which hands are not. So let's first of all look at king 10 and king 9. So if I had like second pair, right, it turns out king 9 is just a pure fold, and king 10 is basically a 0 EV hand. So this really goes to show that, you know, how it goes to show the magnitude of the adjustment that you need to be making, right? Versus button, these hands would easily be a pure call, but because this is UTG versus big blind and UTG's range is so much stronger, right? A lot of these hands they're just not worth anything at this point. Okay? And for hands like, so let's take a look at the gut shots. Right? You can see queen jack with no backdoor, right? Or any gut shot without the backdoor flush draw, pretty much a pure fold. Right? But interestingly, hands like 4-3, 4 deuce, they're all pure calls, right? And they even have a little bit of EV, if I'm not mistaken. So a hand like 4-3 of clubs is actually worth about a quarter of a big blind as a call, right? Compared to queen jack, which is pretty much indifferent, where I was losing about 10% of a big blind. Okay, so the question is, why is it that 4-3 makes a better call than queen jack? Right? Aren't they both gut shots? Right? Shouldn't they have like the same EV? And there are actually two reasons for this. Right? The first reason has to do with your hand's blocker properties. Right? Because let's say if you check call the flop with a hand like queen jack, right? And let's say you get maybe a blank turn. Okay, and if it goes check, check, and the river is, let's just say something like an 8. Okay, in this case, you'll actually notice that your queen jacks and queen 10s, right, they actually don't have fantastic EV as a bet, right? And that's not really because they have showdown value, right? You can see very clearly the EV of checking, at least for queen jack of diamonds, is 0, and for most of these, I mean, we don't really have like offsuit combos, right? But let's say even if we did, right, it would not make that great of a hand to be bluffing with, right? Simply because you block a ton of your opponent's folding range. Right? On the other hand, you can see all of these low combos, right? They actually have a little bit of EV as a bluff, and that's because you don't interfere with your opponent's folding range. So that's the first reason why a hand like 3-4, or at least some of the lower gut shots, they make slightly better calls than the higher gut shots. But I think the most important reason is still the amount of implied odds that you're going to get the times that you hit your hand, right? Imagine if you float a hand like queen jack and then you hit a 10. It's not a particularly attractive card for your opponent. It's not like he's going to just, you know, be piling in money with hands like ace queen and ace jack, right? Given the possibility of all of these straights and two pairs, and even I guess you're not going to have any sets, right? Since you're folding 10s all the time, right? But you're still gonna have a bunch of hands, like quite a few straight combos, right? As well as hands like two pair, right? Because you're calling like ace and offsuit, king 10 offsuit. Right? So naturally, your opponent is going to be a little bit less inclined to be putting money into the pot, right? Which is going to hurt the amount of implied odds that you have. Right? On the other hand, if you float with 4-3 and then you hit your straight, so let's say if the turn is a deuce, on the whole, it's going to be a much safer card for your opponent because it doesn't really change much, right? 4-3 is not a huge part of your calling range, right? So your opponent or even the solver, right, is not going to be terribly worried about it, and therefore he's going to put in more money on average. And to prove that this is correct, we can do a very simple experiment, right, which is just to mess around a little bit with the pre-flop range. So let's say if I remove Queen Jack offsuit specifically from the big blinds range, right, and then we rerun the tree. What we're gonna see is that versus the same 2/3 pot size bet, right, Queen Jack of clubs, right, magically becomes a pure call, and it's even winning about half a big blind as a call now. Right? And of course, the reason is that once you remove Queen Jack offsuit from your range, right, now the 10 is not really going to be a card that UTG is as worried about. Right? So the times that you hit your straight, you're going to have much better implied odds. And if we make one more change to big blinds range, which is to add in a bunch of 4-3 offsuit. Right? So now if we rerun the solution, versus the same bet, right, you see that 4-3 of clubs is now a pure fold, right? Simply because the times that you hit your hand, your opponent, at least in theory, right, a clairvoyant opponent is going to be aware that the deuce is not really a blunt. You're going to have like all of these 4-3 offsuit combos, and he's going to be slightly more cautious, and then that's going to affect the amount of implied odds that you have. So that's the logic behind why a hand like 4-3 actually performs slightly better than a hand like Queen Jack as a call, right? It's because, first of all, you have slightly better blockers, right? But the main reason I would imagine is that you also have slightly better implied odds, given that the times that you hit your hand, it's not going to be a card that your opponent is going to be too hesitant about putting in money. Okay, so this brings us to the final mistake, which is not check raising enough backdoors on the flop. The fact is we need a ton of bluffs on the flop because we have three streets to go, right? 2 more streets to go. And every street, we need to give up a bunch of bluffs. Right? And the objective is, of course, to reach the river with a balanced range and with the appropriate value bluff ratio. So let's say if you make a pot size bet on the river, right, your value bluff ratio needs to be 2:1. But at the same time, if you backtrack to the turn, right, across the turn in the river, you're going to be giving up some of your bluffs, right? Because it's not, of course, not balanced to just check raise the flop and then just continue barreling down all of your bluffs, right? That's really exploitable, right? Your opponent can start slow playing all of the strong hands for one, right, among making other adjustments, right, like calling a lot tighter on the flop, right? So because we need to have this specific value bluff ratio on the river, right? And we also need to give up some bluffs on every street. So with every street that you backtrack, right, you're going to need to have more and more bluffs. So on the river, maybe it's 2 value to 1 bluff. And when you go back to the turn, it's going to be 1 value to 1 bluff. And when you go back to the flop, it might even be as high as 1 value to 2 bluffs. So that's the first reason why it's typically not sufficient to be check raising hands like straight draws and flush draws. And when I say this, I'm referring to boards that are like semi-connected. Obviously, on the board like King 7 Deuce Rainbow, of course, anyone can tell you that we're supposed to check raise backdoors. Right? But even on the more coordinated boards, right, it's typically not sufficient to only be check raising direct draws. Right? First of all, because we need a lot of bluffs on the flop, right, in order to arrive at the river with a balanced range. And the second reason why we need a bunch of backdoors is that if we only check raise straight draws and flush draws, the check raising range becomes really strong and it becomes really linear. And this is going to open up a bunch of exploits for in position. So let's take a look at the last example, right, which is, so on this board of 7, Jack 7-5 two-tone, if button makes a small c-bet, you can see that despite us having a whole load of straight draws and flush draws to choose from, right, the solver is actually still check raising its backdoor hands at quite a high frequency. So looking at hands like ace-4 with the ace of diamonds, right, ace-6 with the ace of diamonds, king-8 with the king of diamonds, all of these hands are actually pure check raises, right? And it might not look like a lot, but all of these combos, they're offsuit combos, and at some point they start to add up, right? So all of these backdoor hands, they might even make up about a quarter of your check raising range or more, right? So it's pretty hard to see from here, but later on when we look at field solver and we do some node locking, I'll show you guys how big of a proportion these hands actually are a part of your check raising range. And of course, the question is, why is it important to check raise these hands when we have so many like gut shots and flush draws to be choosing from, right? So that's a question that is best answered by doing a bunch of node locking. So here we have a very similar looking texture, 10-6, 3 two-tone. So once again, plenty of straight draws and flush draws to choose from. But despite that, you can see that the solver, if you look at the composition of the check raising range, so no pair, no draw. So sorry, just let me do this one more time. So if you look at the composition of the check raising range, no pair, no draw actually makes up 28% of the check raising range, right? Which is a crazy amount, like more than 1/4 of your range actually doesn't have any pair or any kind of direct draw. And again, this ties back to, first of all, the fact that we need a ton of bluffs on the flop, right? And also that there is one more reason that we haven't talked about yet. And again, I think that's best explained by doing a bunch of node locking. So what I've done here beforehand, right, is force the big blind to not check raise all of these backdoor type hands. Right? So previously we had hands like ace-4, ace-5 with the diamond, right? king-7 with the diamond, and then here I've just forced all of these hands to either check call or check fold. So the check raising range becomes very equity driven. It's mostly just like flush draws and straight draws and a bunch of value hands. And you can see that the main adjustment that in position makes, so first of all, in terms of frequencies, right, is to overfold, which is very logical. Right? Previously, we fold 35% of our range. Now it goes up to 42% because we're facing, like in position, just facing a much stronger check raising range. So hands that were previously indifferent, they start to become minus EV. Right? And then one more less obvious adjustment would be that the 3-betting frequency actually increases. So it goes up from 8% to almost 12%. It might not sound like a lot, right? 3 or 4% difference, but of course, percentage-wise, it's a huge increase, right? It's almost a 50% increase in 3-betting frequency, which also kind of makes sense if you think about it. Like previously, when your opponent was check raising a bunch of backdoor type hands, it makes you a little bit reluctant to 3-bet a hand like 10s and 6s, because why do you need to fast play these hands? Like if you put in a 3-bet, your opponent's just going to fold a lot of hands like queen 9 and ace 5 that are pretty much drawing dead against you. So that gives you a little bit of incentive to slow play your hand, right? Hope that some of these hands, pick up some kind of pair, excuse me, pick up some kind of one pair, pick up some kind of equity, and continue putting money in on the turn, right? Instead of just like re-raising and folding them out. But the moment you take away all of these like backdoor type check raises, there's actually very little reason to not fast play a hand like 10s, because if you 3-bet, first of all, your opponent is going to be, chances are, is going to be folding a bit less often, right? So in that sense, you're getting a lot more value since your opponent has less complete trash in his range that is going to fold, and then more hands that can potentially call a 3-bet. Even if he does fold hands like 9-8 and 7-8, right, at the very minimum, you are denying these hands their share of the pot, because even a hand like 7-8 is going to have it's still going to have a gut shot at the end of the day. It's going to have like backdoor flush draw as well, right? So it's still worth something to deny these hands their equity share, like as opposed to a hand like ace-4, ace-5. Yeah, I guess you can say it's worth something as well, right? Because you're folding out a bunch of backdoor outs, right? But the problem is that this is not a hand with any direct outs. So, you know, to 3-bet and fold out this hand is just worth a lot less. So those are the two main adjustments to make, right? Let's say if you think your opponent is not check raising enough backdoors on this kind of texture, right? My advice would be to not bother fast playing a hand like tens, right? There's really very little reason to I meant not to bother slow playing a hand like tens, where there's really very little reason to just call, right? Because, you know, chances are when you raise, your opponent's going to be continuing most of the time, right? Or even if he folds, you're going to be folding out some kind of equity, right? So of course, you know, whether or not your opponent is actually like missing these check raises, that's kind of a different question, right? Probably if you're playing in like live games, right? Especially low stakes live, it's in terms of like poker theory, right? Live games are lagging quite a bit behind, right? So yeah, it's possible that your opponent is not raising these kinds of hands, and you can get away with just overfolding and fast playing most of your strong hands. Right? But I would say nowadays, like any kind of online game, you're going to see a lot of players who naturally understand that they're supposed to check raise these hands, and some players even over check raise as an exploit to take advantage of the fact that the player pool is overfolding on some textures, right? So this might not apply against every opponent. You kind of have to gauge for yourself if your opponent is capable of finding all of these bluffs, right? But if he is not, then the adjustment is really simple: to overfold and fast play more of your strong hands. And this also, in a way, explains why it's so important to check raise these backdoors in the first place, right? Because if you fail to do that, then your opponent is going to adjust away, whereby, you know, he starts to fold a lot and starts to 3-bet a lot. And that's actually the perfect kind of situation to check raise a hand like ace-5 with the ace of diamonds, because your hand obviously benefits a lot from the additional folds, and it doesn't really mind getting 3-bet, where you're pretty happy to just fold your hand versus a 3-bet. So again, to reiterate that previous point, right? The reason why we need to check raise some of these backdoor hands in theory is that if we fail to do it, our opponent adjusts in a way that now makes it really nice to be check raising this kind of hand, right? Just because of all the extra folds that we're getting, and the extra, you know, the extra 3-bet frequency. It's not really something that's going to hurt our specific hand, right? That's a trade-off that we're willing to make any day. If our opponent can fold an extra 7%, even if he 3-bets us an extra 4%, right, that's still a fantastic outcome for a hand like ace-5 offsuit. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of this presentation, right? So this slide here, it sums up all of the previous points, right? Float more versus small, c-bets. Remember to account for position, right? And then also to remember to mix in a bunch of backdoor check raises as well. Although, you know, when it comes to check raising backdoors, it's not going to be every kind of situation where you need to do it, right? Versus early position versus big bet sizes becomes a little bit less important to do so, right? But yeah, that's probably a whole different video altogether, right? So if you enjoyed this webinar, you can also check out my YouTube channel, Poker Giraffe, and I'll hang around for a couple of minutes more to answer any questions. Right, and I hope to see you guys in the next webinar as well.